I never told my daughter what I really kept inside Warehouse 12. And when she married a slick, fast-talking gold digger who was certain he could outsmart a tired old man, I made sure he would never find the key. So, while I sat at home nursing a glass of bourbon on a night when the rain was coming down like nails, my warehouse manager called me in a dead panic. "Sir, your son-in-law's here. He has bolt cutters, and he brought 2 armed men." I did not panic. I had been waiting for this exact moment for weeks. And what I did next brought his entire fake world crashing down around him. If you are connecting with my story, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there right now. It genuinely makes an old man happy to know which corner of the world is listening. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. My name is Silas Dunmore. I am 71 years old, and I spent my whole life building an industrial salvage empire out of rust, sweat, and scrap iron on the outskirts of Cleveland. People look at me now and see a quiet, retired widower who tends his garden and drinks his bourbon in peace. They do not see the man who survived 30 years in the cutthroat steel and salvage trade. It was 11:30 at night, and the rain was hammering the windows when my burner phone buzzed against the desk. Very few people have that number. One of them is Otis Reyes, a 64-year-old Army veteran who has managed my properties with absolute loyalty for 2 decades. I picked up. Otis did not waste words. "Mr. Dunmore, it is happening. Chase is at Gate 4. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the familiar burn slide down my throat. "Is he alone, Otis?"
"No, sir," Otis replied, his breath hitching. "He has bolt cutters, and he brought company, 2 large men. They are armed. I can see the handguns tucked in their waistbands. What are your orders? Do I engage? Do I trigger the silent alarms?" I stood, walked to my desk, and tapped my tablet to bring up the hidden, high-definition surveillance feed I had installed weeks ago. The screen flickered to life in crisp night vision, and there he was, my son-in-law, Chase Whitlock, the self-proclaimed private equity genius, the man who wore suits that cost more than my first truck, standing in the freezing mud, gripping a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters. I watched the rain plaster his styled hair flat to his forehead. I saw the desperate, greedy twitch in his jaw. "No, Otis," I said, dead calm. "Do not engage. Do not call the police. Pull all the perimeter guards back. Open the blind spots. Give him a clear path to the main loading dock." Otis hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He knew me too well to question my sanity. "Are you sure, sir? Those men look like serious trouble." "I am entirely sure," I replied, resting my hand on the framed photograph of my late wife Marlene. "Let him cut the lock, Otis. Let him walk right in. Tonight, he digs his own grave, and I intend to watch him jump into it." I hung up and set the phone down. On the screen, Chase was struggling with the heavy chain on the outer fence, a rat trying to gnaw its way into a steel trap. He thought he was about to secure his financial freedom. He thought he had outsmarted a clueless old boomer. He had no idea what was actually waiting for him behind those rusted doors. To understand how my daughter's husband ended up committing a major federal felony in the dead of night, you have to go back exactly 3 months, to the moment I first realized a parasite had attached itself to my family. It was Hannah and Chase's 2nd wedding anniversary. Hannah is my 32-year-old daughter, the light of my life, a sweet and trusting soul
who runs a small bakery downtown called Wildflower. When Marlene passed, I made a silent vow at her graveside that I would protect our daughter from everything, from heartbreak, from failure, and most of all, from greedy men who prey on kindness. Hannah had organized a celebratory dinner at an expensive steakhouse, and I arrived early in a clean, simple suit, happy just to see her smile. Chase arrived 15 minutes late, loudly complaining to the valet, flashing an expensive watch, acting like he owned the place. He always rubbed me the wrong way. He talked too fast, promised too much, and always seemed to be looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important had walked in. We were halfway through our ribeyes when the conversation took a strange turn.
"So, Silas," Chase said casually, leaning back and swirling his wine, "I was driving through the industrial park the other day, scouting commercial real estate for a fund I am putting together. I passed one of your old properties, Warehouse 12, I think it is called." I stopped chewing. I set my fork down very slowly. I did not react on the outside, but inside, every alarm bell I owned began to ring. I had never discussed my holdings with Chase. I had never mentioned Warehouse 12 to anyone, not even Hannah. It was an old, rusted facility on a neglected patch of land, and the holding company that owned it was buried under layers of legal protection. There was no reason for a private equity man to be driving through that specific rundown district, let alone pulling property records to learn it belonged to me. "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my face slightly confused. "Just an old holding property, nothing but dust and rusted pipes. Why do you ask?" Chase smiled, a slick, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Just curious. Seems like prime real estate if you clear the junk out. A massive footprint. You know, holding on to dead weight like that is bad business, Silas. Taxes, liabilities. Have you ever thought about liquidating it? I have developers in my network who would pay top dollar just for the land." I looked at my daughter. Hannah was blissfully unaware of the tension, sipping champagne, smiling at her husband. She thought he was just being helpful. She thought he was the successful investor he claimed to be. But my gut, honed by decades of dealing with scrap thieves and corrupt contractors and hungry businessmen, told me otherwise. Why would a man who supposedly moves tens of millions in capital care about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? And why, under those expensive clothes, did his eyes look so desperately hungry? I picked up my napkin, wiped my mouth, and let a slow, harmless, grandfatherly smile spread across my face, the kind that makes a predator think his prey is completely blind. "Well, Chase," I said, keeping my voice light and a little raspy, "I am just a retired old man. Real estate markets are over my head these days. I just let it sit there. It is not hurting anyone." I saw a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction in his eyes. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ignorant. He thought he had just found a gold mine guarded by a senile old fool. But sitting there, matching his fake smile with my own, I knew one thing for certain. My daughter was married to a fraud. I did not yet know his angle or how deep the lies went, but I was going to find out. And I was going to tear his whole facade apart, piece by piece, until Hannah could see the truth with her own eyes. I paid the bill without blinking. Chase did not even reach for his wallet. The drive home that night was quiet, the streets slick and reflective under the amber streetlights, and beneath my calm hands on the wheel, my knuckles ached, the old scars from decades of pulling jagged steel apart throbbing with a dull, familiar pain. Men like Chase despise the dirt. They recoil from the smell of sweat and grease, and yet they are always the first to show up with soft,
manicured hands extended, desperate to claim the money that the dirt produced. He looked at me and saw a relic, an outdated fool guarding a pile of useless rust. He never once considered that a man who spent 30 years buying and selling other men's ruined empires might recognize the exact look of a person whose whole life is one bad month away from collapse. I had seen that look 1,000 times across a scrapyard scale. The forced confidence, the eyes that will not hold still, the desperation dressed up in a borrowed suit. My daughter had married that look, and she could not see it, because love had made her kind, and kindness had made her blind. The very next morning, the doorbell rang at 9 sharp. Chase stood on my porch in a tailored navy suit with an expensive briefcase, and Hannah stood beside him, holding his arm, looking up at him with a blind admiration that turned my stomach. I ushered them in and made coffee. Chase unzipped his briefcase and slid a thick, glossy financial portfolio across my coffee table, the kind of presentation you give a board of directors, not your retired father-in-law on a Saturday. "I could not stop thinking about your holdings," he began, leaning forward, elbows on knees, playing earnest. "I did some deep diving into the county records. I just want to look out for the family." The first page showed an aerial map of the industrial district, with Warehouse 12 circled in red ink, beside a breakdown of estimated taxes and liabilities. "You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Silas. That structure is sitting on prime commercial land. As a fund manager, it hurts me to see capital tied up like that." "I have developers in my network right now," Chase continued, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "I can broker a private sale, get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month, and drop a massive cash injection straight into your retirement. You would not have to lift a finger. I will handle all the paperwork." Hannah squeezed his hand and nodded eagerly. "Dad, you have to admit he makes sense. You have worked so hard your whole life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. Chase is a financial genius. Let him help." The rage flared up in me, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room helping a parasite try to drain my assets because he had convinced her he was our family's financial savior. I wanted to grab him by the collar and throw him out the door. Instead, I let my shoulders drop and let out a long, tired sigh. "Well, Chase," I said, tapping a calloused finger against his glossy report, "this is an awful lot to take in. I am not used to moving this fast. My accountant usually handles all this modern financial jargon." Chase smiled, triumph flashing across his face. "You do not have to understand the jargon, Silas. That is what I am here for. I can draw up a limited power of attorney this afternoon, just a proxy so I can negotiate with buyers on your behalf." There it was, the real ask. I shook my head slowly and handed the folder back. "I appreciate the hard work, son, I really do. But I am old-fashioned. I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal with me. Let me go through it this week with a magnifying glass and a cup of tea, and we will talk next weekend." His smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, and in that flicker, I saw the truth. He was not patient. He was desperate. Whatever was chasing him did not give a man until next weekend. That night, I sat in my study, the one room in the house that still smells faintly of the old salvage days, and I thought about how men like Chase look at me. They see the flannel shirt and the old truck, and they assume my life was as simple as my wardrobe. They have no idea what it takes to build a salvage empire from absolute zero. When Marlene and I first married, we had nothing but a rusted pickup and a mountain of debt. I spent 14 hours a day in the yards, breathing burning copper and diesel until it seeped into my pores, stripping wire out of condemned mills, hauling scrap iron until my back felt like it would break in half. Marlene would come down at 7 in the evening with a thermos of black coffee and 2 foil-wrapped sandwiches, and we would sit on the tailgate covered in grime and talk about the future we were building for our little girl. On her deathbed, I promised Marlene I would never let anyone take what we built for Hannah. And in my line of work, you learn fast how to spot a worthless piece of scrap that has been painted up to look like silver. So I did not confront him. I hired a man named Marcus Bell, a former detective who now did quiet private work, and I told him to take Chase Whitlock apart down to the studs. 2 weeks later, Marcus met me in a corner booth of a cheap diner, ordered a black coffee, and slid a thick folder across the scarred table. "You were right to trust your gut," he said, his eyes grim and tired. "The whole operation is smoke and mirrors. Whitlock Private Equity does not exist. It is a rented mailbox inside a shipping center. No office, no board, no portfolio. He has not filed a legitimate tax return in 3 years." I kept my hands flat on the table. Then how is he affording the suits and the leased sports cars? How did he fool my daughter? Marcus slid another page toward me. 2 years ago, Chase actually had money. He inherited a decent sum from his grandfather, and he poured every penny of it into a crypto scheme, chasing a fortune. The platform collapsed. He lost all of it in 48 hours. "Worse than all of it," Marcus corrected, leaning in. "When he lost the inheritance, he borrowed to buy back in, praying for a rebound. When the banks cut him off, he went to the shadow lenders. He currently owes just over $2.4 million to a very dangerous loan shark syndicate out of Detroit. Men like that do not send angry letters. They send people to break legs." My stomach twisted, but Marcus was not finished. "There is more, Silas, and this is the part that is going to make you want to kill him." He pulled a final stack of pages, and I recognized the account name instantly. It was the business account for Wildflower Bakery. When they married, Chase convinced Hannah to let him handle the accounting, to take the stress off her. He has not been managing her books. He has been draining them. Every week for 8 months, he has siphoned thousands out of her account, routing it through shell companies to make the minimum interest payments on his syndicate debt. I picked up the pages and my hands were not quite steady. Chase had stopped paying Hannah's commercial lease 3 months ago. That was why her delivery van had been repossessed the week before, a repossession she had tearfully blamed on a bank error. He had stopped paying her flour suppliers and her utilities. Her bakery, the business she had built from nothing, sketching pastries at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, was insolvent and running on fumes. By the end of the month, the bank would freeze her accounts and force her into bankruptcy. "He is using her as a human shield," I whispered, my voice rough. "He is bleeding her dry to keep himself alive." Marcus nodded slowly. "When a man like Chase starts to drown, he pulls down whoever is closest just to get one more breath. He targeted you because you are his last resort. He needs a massive payout, fast, or those Detroit men are going to collect from him in a way no hospital can fix." I sat in that diner booth for a long time after Marcus left, the coffee going cold in front of me. And I thought about my daughter at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, sketching pastries by lamplight, building something honest out of butter and flour and stubborn hope. Wildflower was not just a business to Hannah. It was the proof to herself that she could make something real without anyone's help. And her own husband had turned it into a hidden faucet, opening it a little wider every week, draining her dream to buy himself a few more days of breathing room, while men in Detroit sharpened their patience. He had let her believe the repossessed van was a bank error. He had let her lie awake, worrying about bills he had quietly stopped paying. And then he had held her while she cried about it. That was the part that turned my grief into something colder and harder than grief. This was no longer about protecting my assets from a gold digger. This was about a predator slowly eating my child alive from the inside, wearing the face of a loving husband while he did it. For a long moment, I wanted to drive straight to their house and end it with my bare hands. But I made myself think it through the way I would work a dangerous demolition. If I confronted Chase directly, if I stormed in shouting the truth, I would become the villain. I would be the paranoid, controlling father trying to ruin his daughter's marriage. Chase would twist my accusations into a wedge, isolate Hannah, and make her cling to him even tighter. I could not attack him. I had to let him believe he was winning. I had to feed his greed until he grew reckless enough to expose his true nature with his own two hands, in a way Hannah could not deny, could not excuse, and could not blame on her father. So I picked up my phone and called Otis Reyes, and I told him I did not have a problem at the yard. I told him I had a rat sniffing at the perimeter, and I needed to lay out some cheese. I told Otis to pull the original lease on Warehouse 12 and make clean copies of the cover pages, the ones showing my name as sole owner and the tax values, but to redact the actual tenant. The truth was, Warehouse 12 had not held scrap in years. I leased it quietly to the federal government as a secured cash and bullion transport staging facility, a hardened hub with armored vehicles and men who do not miss. Chase was going to see a rusted, forgotten building on paper. Then I set the real trap. I emptied my home safe of everything that mattered and moved it to a vault, leaving behind a few decoy bundles of singles wrapped in hundreds and one carefully forged document. It was a fake inventory manifest on official-looking letterhead describing a stockpile of $18 million in unregistered palladium bullion, supposedly stored inside Warehouse 12, with a note about a quiet, off-the-books liquidation. It was the perfect bait for a desperate man hunting a massive, untraceable payday. If Chase cracked my safe, he would not find my savings. He would find a one-way ticket to a federal prison. I ordered 3 hidden cameras disguised as ordinary things, a smoke detector, a clock, a charging brick, and I positioned them to cover every angle of my study with a direct line on the safe. Then I invited Chase over the following week, under the friendly pretense of discussing his proposal. I handed him the redacted deeds and let him believe he was one step from my signature. I played the hesitant, agreeable old man, asking naive questions about markets and buyers, and I watched his eyes drift, again and again, toward the heavy steel safe in the corner. He was not evaluating a real estate deal. He was casing my house. When he left that afternoon, I knew a patient negotiation was the last thing on his mind. A drowning man does not wait for next weekend. He grabs for anything that floats. He broke in 4 nights later. I was sitting in my dark living room watching the study feed on my tablet when Chase slipped through the back door with a small flashlight clenched in his teeth. I watched him work the safe for 20 minutes, sweating until it swung open. I watched him shove the decoy cash aside and freeze when he found the manifest. I watched him read it 3 times, his hands trembling, and I watched a slow, greedy, disbelieving grin spread across his face as the fictional number sank in. $18 million in untraceable metal, sitting in a rusted building guarded by a senile old man who did not even know it was there. He photographed every page with his phone. He put everything back exactly as he found it, careful, thinking himself so clever, never once glancing up at the smoke detector recording his every move. Then he crept out into the night, certain he had just found the answer to all his prayers. He had actually just recorded his own confession and taken the bait straight down to the hook. I did not feel triumphant watching him creep out of my house with a fortune that did not exist glowing in his phone. I felt the cold, steady calm of a man who has finally located the exact point of failure in a structure he intends to bring down. In the salvage trade, you do not tear a condemned building apart by swinging blindly at the walls. You study it. You find the one load-bearing beam that holds the whole rotten thing upright, and you cut it, and you step back, and you let gravity do the rest. Chase's greed was that beam. He believed the palladium was real because he needed it to be real. He believed I was a fool because a fool was exactly what his desperation required me to be. Every lie I told him he had swallowed whole, because a drowning man does not question the shape of the rope thrown to him. All I had to do now was wait for him to grab it with both hands in front of witnesses he could never talk his way past. After that, I simply waited. I knew a man that desperate would not risk brokering a sale or forging a signature and waiting on paperwork, not with a $2.4 million debt and violent men counting the days. No, a drowning man goes straight for the metal. He would come in the night, with muscle, with tools, and he would try to take it by force. So I made my preparations with Otis and with the federal tenants who leased Warehouse 12. And then I did the one thing that mattered most. 2 nights before I expected him, I drove to Hannah's apartment, sat her down, and I did not accuse her husband of anything. I simply told her that if she ever had a single doubt about the man she married, she should trust her father enough to sit beside me one night and watch and decide for herself. She was hurt and confused and defensive at first, but something in her had already been quietly breaking for months, and she agreed to come. Which brings us back to that rainy night, to Chase standing in the freezing mud with his bolt cutters and his 2 armed men, and to Hannah sitting silently beside me in my study, staring at the tablet screen. I had told her only that we were going to watch the truth arrive. On the feed, Chase snapped the outer chain and led his mercenaries across the yard toward the loading dock, through the exact blind spots Otis had opened for him. I felt Hannah go rigid beside me the instant she recognized her husband on the screen, his styled hair plastered flat by the rain, the bolt cutters heavy in his hands, the 2 armed strangers moving behind him like shadows. She did not speak. She did not ask me to explain. She simply watched, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, as the man she had promised her life to crept across a muddy industrial yard in the dead of night to rob her own father. I did not say a word either. There was nothing left for me to prove and nothing left for her to deny. The proof was arriving on its own at 11:30 at night in the freezing rain, exactly as I had known it would. Some truths cannot be told to a person. They can only be witnessed. So I let her witness it. He pried open a side door, and the instant all 3 men stepped inside Warehouse 12, the building woke up. Floodlights blazed to life, turning night into blinding day. A siren split the air, and from behind the armored transport bays, a full federal tactical team rose up, not with sidearms, but with raised assault rifles, every barrel locked on to the 3 intruders. An amplified voice boomed through the loudspeaker. "Federal armored transport, drop your weapons immediately or you will be shot. Do it now!" The mercenaries were violent men, but they were not suicidal. They knew the penalty for threatening a federal transport guard, and they dropped their rifles instantly, lacing their fingers behind their heads and sinking to their knees in the concrete dust. But Chase came completely apart. The polished private equity genius simply ceased to exist. The man who had planned to feed his own wife to loan sharks was reduced in one heartbeat to a shaking, terrified shell. He dropped the bolt cutters with a clatter, and his legs gave out beneath him, sending him down into a puddle of muddy water as a dozen red laser dots danced across his designer chest. Through the high-definition audio, Hannah and I heard him begin to wail, a loud, hysterical, embarrassing sound of pure terror, screaming that it was all a mistake, that he was just a businessman looking for his father-in-law. The guards ignored him, kicked him flat onto his stomach in the mud, and wrenched his arms behind his back. And I watched the dark stains spread across the front of his tailored trousers. I turned slightly to look at my daughter. Hannah was staring at the screen, completely still, utterly mesmerized by the pathetic, humiliating spectacle on the concrete. There was no pity left in her eyes. There was no lingering trace of love or affection for the man begging in the mud. The careful illusion he had maintained for 2 years was permanently, irreparably shattered, and she was finally seeing the cowardly reality of the man who had promised to cherish her forever. After a long moment, she slowly reached over and closed the cover of the tablet, shutting off the feed. She let out a long, shaking breath, and I felt her set down a weight she had been unknowingly carrying for years. She looked at me, her face pale in the low light, and her eyes were completely clear for the first time in a very long time. We did not need grand speeches. She had seen the truth with her own 2 eyes, and that truth had cut every toxic chain he had wrapped around her life. The next morning, the house was profoundly quiet. Hannah sat at my kitchen island with both hands wrapped around a warm mug, pale and exhausted, but the tension that had gripped her shoulders for 2 years was simply gone. I was pouring the coffee when her phone rang, an unknown out-of-state number vibrating hard against the granite. She put it on speaker. A cold, automated voice filled the kitchen. "This is a collect call from the County Correctional Facility. To accept the charges, press 1. Hannah looked at me. I gave her a single nod, and she pressed 1. And then we heard Chase, sobbing, his voice a high, desperate whine. "Hannah, please tell me you are there. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I was just driving past your father's old warehouse, and these armed men jumped out. The police arrested me by mistake. You have to call my lawyer. You have to drain the business accounts and post my bail today. They are talking about federal charges, but it is all a lie. You have to get me out." Even now, in a cell facing decades, he was still trying to use her as a shield, still begging her to empty her dying bakery to buy his freedom. A single tear rolled down Hannah's cheek, but her face hardened into pure revulsion. She opened her mouth to answer, and I gently laid my hand over hers and shook my head. This was not her burden to carry anymore. This last part belonged to me. I lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello, Chase." The sobbing stopped instantly. In the silence, I could almost hear his heart hammering through the line. "Silas," he finally whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Where is Hannah? Why do you have her phone?" "Hannah is right beside me," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "And she is finished listening to your lies. We had a very illuminating evening. We took a scenic drive down to the industrial district, parked across from a certain rusted building, and watched a wonderful show unfold on my security feed." "You were there," he choked out. "You set me up. You faked that manifest. You led me straight into a trap." "I did not set you up, Chase," I corrected, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. "I simply held up a mirror, and you eagerly showed me the monstrous reflection of your own greed. You wanted my warehouse, son. You got it. But you did not break into a clueless old man's abandoned scrapyard. There was no 18 million in palladium waiting to be stolen. You broke into a classified federal cash staging facility. You led an armed assault on a United States transport stronghold with 2 men carrying illegal rifles, and you triggered a full federal response. Enjoy the next 25 years without parole. You are a ghost to us now." He screamed my name in despair, and I pressed the red button, cut him off, and blocked the number for good. The rain had stopped, the morning sun was shining, and my family was finally safe. 1 month later, the clouds over our family had fully parted. Chase sat in a maximum security federal detention center awaiting trial, and the Detroit syndicate he had tried to double-cross was indicted right alongside him. The judge took one look at the mountain of evidence and denied him bail as a flight risk. His divorce from Hannah moved through the courts with surgical speed. On a bright Thursday morning, I drove her downtown to the top-floor office of Everett Shaw, my corporate attorney and a fierce loyalist to my family for 30 years. Hannah sat in a leather chair, giving me a curious, questioning look, and I reached into my coat and set a single heavy brass key on the polished desk between us. She asked what it was for. I smiled, and I covered her hand with mine, and I told her that a man who spends his life building an empire out of jagged scrap learns to hide his most precious things where no one will ever think to look. Chase had spent 2 years hunting a fortune in a rusted warehouse and in vulnerable bank accounts, and he never once understood the depth of a father's foresight. Everett handed Hannah a thick leather portfolio, and I told her to open it. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, struggling to process the figures in bold black ink. Years ago, shortly before her mother passed, Marlene and I had quietly established an impenetrable blind trust entirely in Hannah's name. The real wealth, the true culmination of every 14-hour day I ever spent in those yards, was legally insulated behind layers of ironclad law, completely untouchable by any greedy, manipulative spouse. The brass key opened a private vault holding the bearer bonds and asset deeds that belonged solely to her. Chase had spent his marriage hunting a fortune he never once had the legal clearance to touch. I watched my daughter's face as the numbers finally registered, as she understood that while her husband had been draining a bakery account of a few $1,000s a week and calling himself a genius for it, the true weight of everything her mother and I had built had been sitting quietly in her own name the entire time, wrapped in so many layers of law that 100 men like Chase could claw at it for 100 years and never leave a scratch. Marlene and I had built it that way on purpose, in a lawyer's office, the year the doctors first used the word we did not want to hear. We knew our girl was soft-hearted. We knew that someday someone would try to take advantage of that softness. So we made sure that the one thing a predator could never reach was the one thing that mattered most. It was not a secret I kept to be cruel or to test her. It was a wall I built around my child while I still had the strength to build it. Tears spilled down my daughter's face, and she stood and wrapped her arms around my neck, and I held her, feeling the bond between a father and his girl fully restored. Later that week, with Chase's secret drain finally cut off, Hannah reopened Wildflower. The business began to flourish almost overnight. She hired 2 new bakers to keep up with the orders, and her laughter rang through the warm, fragrant shop again, the sound of a woman reclaiming her own life. That Sunday evening, I sat alone on my porch with a glass of good bourbon while the low sun spread gold across the lawn. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the sky. "I kept my promise, Marlene," I whispered to the wind. Greed is a blinding poison. It convinces arrogant men they are smarter than everyone in the room. And when they try to exploit the love of a family to line their pockets, They only ever build their own inescapable cage. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson beneath it is as real as cold iron. In the salvage business, you learn fast how to tell real silver from something that has only been painted to shine. Chase never learned the difference, and it cost him everything. True wealth was never in that warehouse, or in a bank account, or in a fabricated manifest. It was in a promise I made to a dying woman, and in the daughter we built our whole lives to protect. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they earned with their own hands. My name is Silas Dunmore, and everything I built, from the rust and the sweat, I gave to the one person who was ever worthy of it.